thank you for joining us at this. And by the way, just so you know, on the stage, the lights shine so brightly on you, we can barely see you. So either come closer or just when you do ask questions later, wave wildly. It's like being on Broadway up here, I'll tell you. I'm thrilled to have a fabulous group of panelists joining me from Louisiana, from further afield, from the Tulane faculty. And so first I'm going to introduce them, but as you'll see, the topic of the panel there's kind of two sort of intertwining topics. We have the topic that's been announced to you on government structures meeting new grid realities, but also I think we're going to model some of the things that we're going to talk about the interface between policy and academia and research and policy making. So I'm excited to introduce these panelists. To my immediate left, the Honorable Davante Lewis is Louisiana Public Service Commissioner for District 3, which includes 10 parishes, including Baton Rouge and New Orleans metro area. He is Chief Strategy Officer for Invest in Louisiana, working to develop and implement its strategic vision and goals of policy advocacy, coalition building, and outreach. And in this role, he also drives Invest's campaign strategies for policy wins and expanding engagement work to center people in the policy-making process. Sitting to his left is Professor Joshua Basseches, who's the David and Jane Flowery Assistant Professor in Environmental Studies and Public Policy here at Tulane in the School of Liberal Arts. He has a dual appointment in the Department of Political Science and the program in Environmental Studies. His research and teaching focus on energy and climate policy and politics, especially in the United States. He examines the roles of business actors, environmental and ratepayer advocacy organizations, and state-level policymakers in shaping policy content and design. And then finally, far away from me, is Drew Story, who is the policy director at the MIT Climate Policy Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he guides MIT faculty through strategic policy engagement to increase the impact of their research. Prior to joining MIT a couple years ago, Drew served as a policy advisor in the US Senate on energy, environment, and scientific research policy issues. And I don't know what you can see, but if you were really close, you could see that prior to that, he's wearing a bolo in the shape of the state of Texas, where he tells me he grew up. So that's a little part more of his bio. First, you've welcomed the panel, but I'm going to ask them first to just say, we'll start with Drew, to say a word about how that kind of biography that I mentioned kind of influenced the work that they're doing and kind of launch us in this conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dean Edwards, and thank you to everyone here for having me. The bio sketch, including the little tidbit about Texas, where I'm born and raised and all my family still is, definitely influences the work that I do now and the work that I've done up to joining MIT. MIT's new Climate Policy Center is really setting out to do what I consider to be one of the most important and underutilized partnerships between policy and academia. The goal is to provide useful, timely, deliberative information using the public resources and private resources that have been funneled into universities for research sake and making them more useful to society. By getting that back outside of the ivory tower and into places where decisions are being made. And so my time in graduate school in California, my time in the Senate, my time underneath the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and now at MIT, I get to bring together my ability to kind of navigate and speak the language of academia, as well as navigate and speak the language of public policy, and filter all that through being from a place not unlike many of you here, where when oil prices go up, it's good for jobs locally. Like, I'm from one of those tiny oil towns in East Texas. Mm-hmm. So thinking about climate as more than just this global quantification of emissions, but thinking about the job impacts and livelihood impacts of climate policy is something I try to bring to that work.
Great, thanks. Josh.
Oh, great. Well, it's great to be here. I am a political science and sociology researcher, and most of my research has been on the politics that inform state-level renewable energy policy. It's up until historically, the states have actually led on renewable energy policy. The federal government has recently become much more involved, but the states in general are very important when it comes to energy, and so I research how different interest groups, as well as utilities, as well as independent energy developers interact with state-level policymakers to shape the energy future.
Great. Yeah, so Davante, how does your personal story motivate your commitment to rebuild the utility system for the future?
No, absolutely. And first, also, thank you for having me. I think when we think about our energy future and the energy transition that we're under, oftentimes the one conversation that is left out is the utility sector. And the utility sector will make or break America's clean energy future. And there is a powerful body of 3 to 5 people in every state that is determining what your utilities are doing in terms of their generation mix to provide America's power. And these are public service commissions or public utility commissions or corporation commissions, depending on the state or jurisdiction that you live in. And so we often forget about these regulatory roles as the drivers. I mean, I'll tell you 90% of my colleagues across the country who are commissioners either come from the utility industry, from the fossil fuel industry, a governor appointee, they've worked in renewable energy. 10% of commissioners come from somewhere else, and I'm one of those 10%, a former public school teacher, public policist who's now regulating generation, transmission, and distribution of our utility system. And why I think that's important is because we have to look at how we pair reliability, sustainability, and affordability and resiliency all together, right? And if you're not looking at this conglomerate, you are going to run the risk of either hurting or harming our future. And what I mean by that is if we aren't transitioning in a just way, that is also looking at the affordability of the price per kilowatt hour that a renewable energy source is doing, and people who are experiencing hardships see their bills increase because now they're paying more, that's going to harm any future of renewable development in that state or that local jurisdiction, as Josh was talking about. And so if you're not balancing the experience of people along with the development of technology, but in a way that is incentivizing a future, you run the risk of actually harming more than helping. And that's what I'm hopeful that my experience working in public policy, working with disadvantaged communities, thinking about how things affect them and what the effects of not doing an energy transition means to communities, is hopeful to navigate this conversation.
That's great. Josh, let me follow up on that statement by talking about the interface between the federal system, the federal government, and the states. How do you see how the U.S. federal system can either help or hinder, facilitate, or impede that clean energy transition?
Well, that's a great question. So as Davante knows well, a lot of the regulatory and policy decisions that affect the grid are made at the state level. And yet the grid itself is not confined to state borders, which is a really interesting governance issue, right? Because you have electrons flowing across state borders, and you do have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which oversees, the entire grid. But a lot of the decisions about energy mix and about distribution of costs and about, affordability, all the things that the commissioner talked about are made at the state level. Now, historically, this has actually, for those that are concerned about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, this has actually been a benefit because the federal government has been very, very slow to take action in these areas, but a number of states have innovated with policies like renewable portfolio standards and other decoupling, redesigning rates. And so depending on who's in power in DC and who's in power in the states, it can be either a benefit or a hindrance. But regardless, the reality is that in the United States, state governments have a lot of power, and specifically commissions have a lot of power. Even though a lot of the media pays attention to what's going on at the national level, a lot of what's happening at the state level. So a lot of people have been asking me, what is this new administration in DC going to mean? And I tell them, well, it's just going to mean that the states are going to have to go one direction or another direction, but the action's just going to be continuing at the state level.
Davante, how do you see that question, flipping it around essentially?
No, I think Josh is absolutely right. I mean, when you are looking at what we're faced with, it is these inner challenges. I mean, Josh just mentioned FERC, which is the Federal Regulatory Energy Commission, and they just passed a new order, 1920, that was encouraging states to look at transmission with one another. So that means we can flow, let's say, cheap wind from the Midlands to the South. We can take solar that is developing in the South and transmit it to the North. One of the challenges that we're running in this, and what you're seeing, which has divided the commissioner community, has been the cost allocations. Where Louisiana, my colleagues, I objected, but all voted to say, no, we don't want to pay to build transmission lines that may benefit the North. And so I think what we're going to see is we saw under the Biden administration significant investments to incentivize utilities and states to take action, whether it be the grid deployment office or the loan office or grid enhancing technologies that were being subsidized by the federal government. You saw that. I was able to move a lot of our utilities here in Louisiana towards enhancing technologies and distributing the grid simply because I had federal resources that said, hey, you're leaving money on the table that Louisiana can benefit. With that gone, that's now a new challenge that everyone may go back to the federal, but it's going to come back to the states to actually say, wait, no, utilities, don't retreat, continue to make those investments, whether it is in renewable generation or if it's in a distributive grid that allows consumers to also be prosumers. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think a lot of where the power lies that people forget is that the state commissions are really one of the most powerful places in our energy sector that just does not get the coverage that it deserves.
Drew, I'm wondering, given your professional background, both advising the U.S. Senate and now as policy director at this MIT center, how you think in this kind of conversation, academics or researchers or individuals can be useful to policymakers as they're grappling with these kinds of issues or these kinds of decisions that affect electricity governance.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to share an example that the Climate Policy Center has taken on this question of transmission grid reliability. So while FERC is talking about, asking states to plan together, there's this thorny issue of cost allocation. There are floating around ideas, policy proposals of varying ways to require or incentivize this interregional transmission and sharing for the sake of improving reliability, reducing costs, reducing air pollution and emissions. And so MIT, we have a lot of analytical tools and research horsepower that has been pumping out, academic publications. Well, we decided the Climate Policy Center would take one of those tools, hire a researcher to use those tools to directly analyze and compare a lot of these different policy proposals. So if you require regions to share a certain amount of their peak load with their neighbor, what does that mean for reliability of the grid during a winter storm Uri in the future, for example? And so we have the analytical results that are no longer presented as though coming from an industry stakeholder or from an advocacy group. It's an academic exercise. It maintains the academic rigor, but we had to come at it with a little bit of a different perspective, that we have to be faster than the typical academic timeline. We have to be more deliberate in two-way dialogue to make sure that the questions we're asking, because academics are used to deciding which questions to ask. Which questions should we ask that policymakers will get the most benefit out of? And then how do we present that in a way both to the policymaker and their team as well as all the policy stakeholders to show and very easily compare across these different policies. So depending on where you come from and what your priorities are, you can compare, weigh the pros and cons of those policies.
That's great. I just want to follow up on that. And as I said at the beginning of this, in some ways this panel is meant to model that kind of conversation that we're trying to encourage in the whole forum itself. So how do you keep that conversation going? And I really like the way you framed the structural differences, let's say, between government priorities and ways of working and academic ways of working. And it should be a strength, but also can be a challenge. How do you model that? Yeah.
Well, so there has to be some change to the the typical incentive structure where faculty or researchers or postdocs are typically evaluated by publications, their teaching or their service to their department, maybe even innovation, which we have heard some about already in the last couple days, but rewarding or allowing for policy engagement to be part of a academic's overall portfolio of societal contribution is a fix to the incentive structure that I personally think is going to happen if we want to see more academics be useful. But it really just takes very humble and open two-way dialogue. So finding the policymakers who are struggling with questions and saying, look, we have some resources that we can offer. Let us help you, but we don't want to come in saying, look, we know what you're struggling with, and we know the questions that you need answered, and we've already done it. So I think entering that conversation with some humility that policymakers have a lot of different objectives they're trying to satisfy, not just the quantitative questions that we might be able to contribute to.
No, that's great. And I'll say, although I'm moderating this panel, these kinds of questions are ones that we're asking, speaking now in my role as a dean, that we're asking on the dean level and incentives and deans across deans, and really at Tulane, about how we think about those traditional ways of measuring, evaluating, and promoting faculty, and really pushing on publicly engaged scholarship, publicly meaningful and community engaged scholarship, which I think Tulane is actually becoming a national leader on thinking about how to do and evaluate that kind of work. So Davante, flipping it around, now he's based all the way up in Massachusetts, in Boston Red Sox country. But what were we saw you here not too long ago on this very stage when the Flowery Symposium, the inaugural Flowery Symposium, which Josh was the co-organizer of. What are the kinds of questions that you think, and we're going to turn to Josh next, that we can collaborate on, or the researchers here at Tulane, as you do your work in the legislature?
No, absolutely. I think that is the challenge, that we are in a race. And I think that is where the hardship between academic and policy engagement finds itself in a crunch, right? We know right now, based off of electrification, based off of data centers, AI centers, we are in a need of load growth, which means we need more capacity to make sure that the grid is reliable. Utilities know that, private investments know that, even the clean energy push of electrifying our car fleet or our homes is increasing the demand for electricity. If we don't have the research available about what a distributive grid looks like, about how I can use demand response or flex load management as a tool to reduce that capacity growth, I am put in a bunch as a commissioner, because here I have where we have put rules that require utilities to maintain certain amount of capacity to ensure reliability. And if I'm looking at a projection that says, hey, this data center that Entergy just announced in North Louisiana needs 3,000 megawatts and they're going to be short, I'm put to say I need to ensure that the grid's reliable. And so if I don't have that research and tools about what it looks like to have a grid that can be different, and the utility presents before me, as they have, 2 gas generator turbines, I'm stuck with the question, do I say no and have the grid unreliable and talk about blackouts and brownouts? Or do I now contribute to the already bad ecological system that we have of using gas generation as our only option to do so? And so that's where I think some of the work comes in, is that there is a timeline, and sometimes policymakers, as much as we may want to, and think about it, are faced with situations that do not have the time to wait for the resources and the research and advocacy to finally catch up.
Josh, building on Davante's point there, how do you think we can democratize electricity governance, and what do you think some of the pros and cons of doing so may be?
First of all, from the academic side, I completely agree with what Davante has said. He might email me and see if I have any insight about his decision, and I'm busy writing my book about state-level renewable energy policy from the early 2000s, so it's a little bit of a disconnect. But regarding democratizing the electricity grid, one of the things that my research has discovered is that in a lot of commissions across the state, the main actor that they hear from would be the monopoly investor-owned utility. And that's because they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of expertise, and the answer is not to just say like utilities are evil, because they have a lot of expertise and we need their expertise, but they also have a incentive to deliver profits for their shareholders. And so policymakers, they need to hear from a lot of different voices, but they also need those voices to have expertise, so that they're not faced with the prospect of making a decision and then being blamed for something like Winter Storm Uri. And so democratizing the electricity grid, I think starts by educating people about the electricity grid. And that's why I love doing events like this, because I want everyone to know what a public service commission or public utility commission is. And I want, academics to know that. I want ordinary folks to know that. I want foundations that are funding research to know that. And right now, it's mostly just the utilities that know that. So I think that's the benefit of democratizing, is we can get other voices. We do need the voices to be well informed, but we can start the process of informing them. And I think the tools that the MIT Center has are great. And this is something that we need to keep working at. But I think that the energy transition gives us an opportunity to democratize the grid that may not have existed before, because before we were worried about, emissions, we just were, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? It was like, as long as the lights come on, that was all we cared about. But now we have other objectives as a society that we're trying to balance as well.
So Drew, when we were talking a moment ago, and now Josh and Davante are modeling it, we talked about understanding that interface between academia and research and policymakers. More directly, what do you think policymakers and community members need to know about that collaboration with academics?
Yeah, I mean, they both highlighted this difference in pace. The ability to respond quickly will make or break, I believe, this is speaking as a former policy staffer. The ability of an expert to respond quickly on the timeline I have to advise my senator on, for example, will make or break the relationship on me coming back to you for advice and insight. And so academics and researchers need to be able to play both, stay in their slow and steady academic lane and then hop into the fast-moving sprint lane of a policymaker when that happens. I think that community members, other stakeholders, policy influencers, whatever you want to call them, that aren't the formal capital P policymaker, needs to know about academia is, again, their incentive structure, how they're rewarded, but also that they want to have impact. They want their work to count for something. They're not all just ivory tower, really just want to advance the state of knowledge. They want to see societal benefit, but they bring to the table a different world. And so being able to say to an academic, hey, look, I understand that you need to make an academic contribution with your time and effort. I need some policy advice, or I need some research advice for the policy decisions I've got to make. Or I'm an advocacy group or a community group. We don't have the expertise to do this, but we would like to collaborate with the academic community to put some numbers to these ideas. There's going to have to be some trust and sharing between not only what the numbers say, but what the values are, and academics have to be kind of an honest broker in between those conversations to say, I am a real human being with my own values and objectives, but I've also produced this analytical work that I will now then hand to you for you to use to make your decision.
Davante, it's really interesting too, and that last thing you said about being a human being who's also a researcher, or people who have to advance their careers but also care about what they're doing and wanting to have an impact. Your constituency is broad and includes people from all parts of life and all different relationships, but they all use and think about energy in some way or another too. How do you see that interface? And I want to come to students in a moment too, the next generation of Louisianans, of Americans, who are also in our classroom. And I say, and one of the things that's great, is a little sidebar here, one of the things that's great and somewhat unique in the United States is that our greatest research institutions, we also have our research faculty teaching undergraduates. And that's something we're very proud of here. But it's different in Europe, for example, where you might have research centers and so on. So they're a part of the equation too. But anyway, talking about the broader constituency in these, how do you see that?
No, I was truly, well, first I would say the challenge is most commissions across this country aren't elected. Louisiana is an outlier. We are one of 10 states across the country where the commissions are directly answering to the people of their state. The vast majority are either appointed by the governor or by the legislature, which creates almost a third degree of separation between the people. But here, let's use my case, for example. I like to say my district is one of the most fascinating, if not the most fascinating place to be a public service commissioner. So as you know, I represent from the Port of Baton Rouge all the way here into the city of New Orleans. I have what is the industrial corridor. I mean, Shell has 4 petrochemical refinery plants in the United States of America. 3 of them are in my district. I also represent Cancer Alley, one of the places where black and brown people are 21 more times likely to be exposed to air pollution than any other place in the world. So when you are battling major industry with also significant health increases, as well as one of the most impoverished areas, not only in the state, but in the nation, that's a real question about reliability, sustainability, and affordability, which is a balancing act of understanding the differences. And kind of going back to the last point, when I say this, the challenge that we face and why we have to build this is like, I'm gonna use a real life example. I have a utility that filed for gas generation tariff for 300 megawatts, not major, right? It's gonna cost, confidential, but millions of dollars over 10 years. I almost breached a rule there. But here's where, if I had that innovation and that connection with students and with faculty to showcase that, hey, if I just made the grid more flexible, if I provided some, let's say, long duration battery storage to a few of your large commercial users, and then we did some more work in demand response using our AMI meters and smart thermostats to switch a degree or here or two, and that right there is 300 megawatts, that's a very different decision that I make. But the challenge is, once I've made that decision to allow a utility to build a gas generator for 300 megawatts, and then the research comes to me and say, hey, you could have done this with distributive grid models, I'm now stuck with saying, if I undo that, that means that's a stranded asset that now the utility puts on people's bills, and I'm saying I'm not going to now also increase their bills with new emerging technology. And so that's the real divide we're facing ourselves with, is how do we get the innovative solutions in front of regulators and policymakers in enough time so when a decision is in front of them, I can say, well, wait, utility, have you looked at long duration storage? Have you looked at demand response? Have you talked about energy efficiency as a way to curb this 300 megawatt shortage that you see in ways that where a lot of my colleagues don't? And the last point that I will say is we can't assume, and I say this with the utmost respect, that all of my colleagues are actually their own innovators to go out and do this research on their own.
Right.
And so if it's not presented in front of them, they're not thinking about a distributive grid.
Yeah. Josh, the name of our forum is The Future of Energy, so I'm going to ask you a question about students and the kinds of questions they bring to you. But first, I want to brag about you, because, and actually not just brag about you as a researcher, which I'm very proud to do, but also the position that we created that then recruited you from a national search is kind of behind the question, which is that in the introduction, I mentioned that Josh is both a professor of political science and of environmental studies and holds this named professorship. And really the idea of creating such a position was to help inspire not only the research behind that, but students of the next generation on what we would call science-based public policy, right? So Josh is, a policy expert, but he also has this deep passion and knowledge about environmental policy. The students of this generation, so-called Generation Z, tell us in a variety of ways that they care a lot about the future of energy, the future of the environment. Our environmental studies program here at Tulane in the School of Liberal Arts is one of the fastest growing programs, and it's, as we say sometimes, enrollment is activism for students. What classes they take shows where administrators should put resources. So what do you see from your students, or what kinds of questions are they raising as we think about the future of energy?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to recognize the program director of environmental studies, Laura McKinney, who's in the audience.
You can see through these glaring lights.
Only because she's sitting in the middle. If she was, I cannot see the people on either side. But no, that's a great question. So the students are super, super interested in understanding climate and energy policy, and I actually do think that that is a way to bridge this divide, because, you know, when Commissioner Lewis is looking to hire someone, right, if they already, so few people know about how, you know, public utilities 101, like even a lot of law schools are catching up trying to, you know, with their public utility law programs. And so students, if they already kind of, I can't necessarily tell them whether Entergy's proposal to build 2 gas plants is going to, you know, I can't necessarily give them the numbers in real time, but I can train them to understand sort of the political economy of energy more broadly, so that if they then go to work for a public utility commission or for FERC or in any of these energy adjacent spaces, they're not starting at the beginning. Like they have the background to then focus on the real-time trade-offs, knowing like the longer-term consequences. So yeah, so the demand is incredibly high. You know, the number of students that want to do honors theses, the number of students that are enrolling in the classes. It's, you know, they know that this is going to be like, you know, the future of energy is going to be like one of the biggest challenges of the century, and so they want to be involved. And it's about training them to have the right approach to analyzing these problems, that kind of what we do.
And Davante, from your perspective, as you think about us educating, you know, at the college level, but earlier in high school levels too, what do you think educators in higher education should be looking to do to help train folks, whether they're voters and citizens or people working towards these questions?
No, I think Josh's point is absolutely right, and that has been the challenge. I'm reminded of when I came on as a commissioner. You know who teaches the course about utility regulation? It is the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association for utilities. So they were the ones to teach me how to regulate them. So when we had, and I have brought in a lot of younger people who had some basis, it even shifted me. My policy director has a background in energy policy, and when he came, there were things that I was like, okay, I went in this meeting, I understood this, and he's like, no, you got to think about it this way. And it's just some types of the education that even I had gaps in. And so I think what we really have to do is the exposure of recognizing what exists, how things move. I often say when people think about climate and they think about our energy future, very few people are thinking about regulatory law, are things, and I've been stressing, like, hey, look, if you want to be a civil rights attorney, what's a better way to be an environmental civil rights attorney to ensure that Black and brown communities are not facing catastrophic levels of pollution and emissions, right? So I think it's just the connectivity between the issues that people already care about and the exposure and where this field is going and what's the opportunities in this field. And that's something that I've tried to do is make sure that in my role I'm still building the opportunities of engagement. That's why I do a lot of lectures and I come around to say, like, this exists and here are the unknowns that you didn't know was there, but like where the power truly lies sometimes is the hidden gem, which is normally where we need the most help at.
That's great. In a moment, I'm going to open this up for questions out there in the glare. So think if you have one that you want to ask. Drew, you're up in Cambridge and MIT. I think a pretty good school. I've heard of it. You're surrounded by schools. I've suggested over the last weekend to some Boston residents who have kids here that you should change the license plate of Massachusetts to Land of Colleges. There's so many. But how are you thinking about this up in Massachusetts or in your role in the Senate about the next generation's questions, passions, and how we should be training them?
I think anybody who's done a graduate degree with a research component knows it's the graduate students that are doing most of the work. The graduate students are the ones who come in for their master's or their PhD. They make the novel contribution to the field. They make the novel improvement to the model or the tool, and then they go on. And only a small handful of them will stay in academia. The others will go out into STEM adjacent fields. So teaching them, one, how can your analytical skills be useful in real-world questions and challenges is got to be part of the preparation. MIT has a really cool technology and policy master's program, and so a lot of those students are the ones who have developed these tools that the Climate Policy Center is now deploying to hand over to the commission and say, look, here's a capacity expansion grid tool. Play around with it, slide around. What does adding a production tax credit do? What does requiring transmission do? You do it. The students have been the ones that have made those contributions, but because they go on and leave, MIT and our faculty who have the body of work and the expertise then make themselves available to the policymaker and empower them to use those tools.
Well, and that interface between understanding the science, caring about it, researching it, and then the analytic tools, the ability to understand policy, how it gets made is exactly what we're trying to model here. And as a proponent of liberal arts, as the dean of the School of Liberal Arts, exactly that interface is, I think, important. We do have time for questions from the room, and I believe that
we have questions that have been submitted using the QR code. We have time for just a couple of them. First, we have a question for Commissioner Lewis. With regard to renewable energy, how is the Louisiana Public Service Commission addressing the inevitable demand due to AI, electric vehicles, and so forth?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. We have recently been more aggressive. We are still woefully behind. I would say just about 3% of our overall grid is renewable energy. If you look at our largest utility, Entergy, only about 0.61% of their generation mix we would call renewable energy of solar or wind or battery storage. And so what we're seeing is the push. We recently approved a 3 gigawatt tariff for Entergy to acquire solar generation. We have created a Louisiana nuclear framework that my colleague Commissioner Scrametta has pushed through. Out of the 169 projects that are in the RTO MISO's queue of new development, new build-up, we're dealing with about 158 of them are renewable projects, but we are not where we need. Louisiana does not have a renewable energy portfolio standard. We are not examining or evaluating each proposal on the face of a standard goal of decarbonization and moving towards renewable energy, and I think that's a challenge. That's why some of this research is important, because I'm faced with these questions where the utilities are proposing a lot of gas buildup to hit our demand growth, but we have significant opportunities that exist. And so that's what I'm trying to lead the commission to do. We were hopeful a lot of this federal dollars from the IRA and the IJA and the would suffice, but we'll see where that goes.
We probably have time for one more question. We have a question that says, there have been cases in Texas where rates of wind and solar generation have driven wholesale electricity prices negative. This penalizes nuclear plants that don't have the flexibility to adjust to wholesale markets. What can be done to protect nuclear plants?
Who's that for?
who wants to go in for that? Who's got something to say about it?
Go, Josh. You can go
I don't
first.
have much to say. I mean, I think when we talk about protecting this or protecting that, I mean, these are all companies that have a particular technology that are trying to make themselves useful and trying to get paid for the capacity and the energy that they're able to deliver for the grid. Now, all of these technologies have pros and cons, both from an environmental standpoint and from a cost standpoint, and they're all both creatures of public policy, and they inform public policy. So I'm not sure that we necessarily should be protecting one type of technology or the other. I think the key is the grid affordable, reliable, and is it not making the climate uninhabitable? Those are kind of like the three criteria.
Yeah, and I would briefly add, I think one of the challenges that regulators are faced with is figuring out that capacity value and what that price is, right? I mean, I think one of the challenges that I've always said with gas generators, for example, is we're running gas generators around 36% of their productivity. If we move them to 65% of their productivity, we could actually distribute the grid a lot faster, making sure those long duration battery storages work. So I don't think it's, I think Josh is correct. It's not about protecting one, but it's finding that formula that works for the generator to be cost effective for rates to be affordable. And that's going to be the balance. And right now, especially in Texas, the solar side has been a cheaper value for ERCOT and the Public Service Commission to utilize, which is why they're probably moving that way, especially after what we saw in Hurricane Uri, Winter Storm Uri, when their gas generators did not produce and perform as they should have.
Right. And if I could just add, in case the person that asked that question, is a nuclear fan, there are a lot of good attributes of nuclear energy. It does not emit greenhouse gases, and it's base load. And so the technology itself, every technology itself has its advantages and disadvantages.
Great. We are at time at this panel, and I really want to thank the three of you for joining us and having this really vibrant conversation that I learned a lot from, and I'm sure the audience appreciated it. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for this conversation.